Because there's a natural connection between 4.1 and 4.2, this screencast will be both of those combined. So let's take a look at 4.1 and the lesson objectives. So we're going to look at why we need energy to begin with and the difference between autotrophs and heterotrophs. We're going to be looking at the difference between an energy-rich molecule called glucose, which is a sugar from plants, and ATP, which is an energy-rich molecule that we all have. We can't make glucose though. And we're going to be outlining how living things make and use food. Virtually all life on our planet gets its energy from organisms which are called autotrophs. Sometimes you'll hear these also referred to as producers because they produce energy. So autotrophs are organisms that make their own food. And the way they do this is a process called photosynthesis, and that's what we're going to talk about in this section. So if you take a look at 4.1, the diagram here, these are all different organisms that make energy from sunlight. There are regular plants, there's algae, and there's certain types of bacteria that can do it as well. So let's take a look at this diagram. Here's a diagram which is called a food chain, and this food chain shows sunlight hitting grasses along with water, and this is referred to as a producer. So this producer is the same as an autotroph. So this grass is taking sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide from the air and creating grass, but it's also making an energy-rich molecule called glucose. And this primary consumer, this grasshopper, will eat the grass and get energy for its life from this glucose, ultimately from the sun. This frog, which is a secondary consumer, will eat the grasshopper, which ate the grass, which got its energy from the sunlight. That's how it powers its body. This snake will eat the frog. You get the idea. So basically energy is moved up this food chain all the way up to the final consumer, which in this case is the hawk. When the hawk dies, all of its particles will be decomposed into the earth and recycled, and the whole cycle, the whole food chain cycle, will start again. There are two energy-rich molecules that we're going to talk a lot about in this chapter and really in our course. And the first one is glucose. Glucose, because it ends in OSE, is also referred to as a sugar or a simple carbohydrate. And notice its chemical formula, C6H12O6. Again, those elements, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, which is in all life. And the important thing about glucose is it stores energy in a concentrated and a stable form. When you eat plants, vegetables, fruits, you are taking in glucose, which your body will then turn into another energy-rich molecule called ATP. ATP is the energy-carrying molecule that cells use for all the energy of all their processes. So make sure you read this carefully, know the distinction. Glucose is the energy-rich molecule, is made by green plants. ATP is in all cells on our planet to run the machinery and the processes inside of all cells. This is a really important diagram, and what it does is it compares and contrasts photosynthesis and cell respiration in a conceptual way. So this is a chloroplast. This is an organelle that is found in green plants. And in this chloroplast, there's a special type of chemical called chlorophyll that allows photosynthesis to take place. So this chloroplast takes in water, it takes in sunlight, and it also takes in carbon dioxide. And those are the two materials and the one energy source it needs to make glucose and oxygen. Now, the mitochondrion, which is another organelle which is in all of our cells, we don't have chloroplast. Animals don't have chloroplast because we're consumers, but plants do. But the mitochondria, which is in all of our cells, will take in that glucose and oxygen and will make tons of ATP for us. And ATP is what energizes the cell. Interestingly, a waste product from the mitochondria is carbon dioxide. Right now, at this instant, you are breathing out carbon dioxide, which ultimately will be used by green plants to make more glucose. This is a great sentence in your book. It says, photosynthesis is often considered to be the single most important life process on Earth. Why? Because it supplies energy to all life on Earth. It changes light energy into chemical energy and it releases oxygen. Without photosynthesis, there would be no oxygen in the atmosphere. That means we couldn't be here. Photosynthesis involves many chemical reactions, but they can be summed up in one equation. Here's the equation. 6 carbon dioxide molecules with 6 water molecules, along with light energy, will produce 1 molecule of glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen. Oxygen is a waste product of photosynthesis. So make sure you read this and understand this carefully. Now we're going to go into photosynthesis and cell respiration in more detail in this chapter, but for now, just understand that cell respiration burns the glucose for energy, okay? But it doesn't produce light or intense heat. What it does is it produces molecules of ATP. So let's look at this equation. This equation is the opposite of photosynthesis. Glucose, C6H12O6, plus oxygen. That's why you're breathing in right now. You ate your food to get the glucose. You're breathing in the oxygen. That will give us, once we do cell respiration in all our cells, it will give off 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 water molecules, H2O, and it will create more ATP, which are energy-rich molecules. Cell respiration occurs in the cells of all living things because all living things need energy from ATP. So before we go on to section 4.2, let's just summarize this lesson. Living things need energy to carry out life processes, and they get that energy from food. They also get it from oxygen. Autotrophs make their own food. Heterotrophs, which is what we are, get their food by eating other things. Glucose and ATP are used for energy by nearly all living things. Glucose is used to store and transport the energy. ATP uses it within the cell, inside the cells. So make sure you read this and make sure you understand the difference between those two. And now we're going to move on to section 4.2, which is photosynthesis in a little more detail. So in 4.2, we're going to look at photosynthesis a little more closely. Sugar as food, glucose as food. Now remember that in this course, I may not be going in the detail. I don't want you to know some of these diagrams in the detail that they're shown in your text. So just listen carefully in the screencast to know what you should know for the quiz. So let's look at the lesson objectives. So they're going to outline the stages of photosynthesis. They're going to look at the chloroplast, where it happens, where photosynthesis happens. They're going to look at the steps of the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. Then they're going to talk about something called chemosynthesis, not photo, which means light, but chemosynthesis, and we'll talk about that at the very end of this section. So this is a really important diagram which shows the 2 phases or the 2 stages of photosynthesis. They are the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. Now you're going to see much more detailed pictures of this, but this is the one that I'll probably pull some questions from, so be very, very conscious of that. So let's take a look at this. So in the stages of photosynthesis, water comes in during the light reaction, light comes in also, and oxygen is a waste product of that. Then in the Calvin cycle, carbon dioxide comes in here and sugar, but this we can say this as glucose. This is glucose. When they say sugar, they mean glucose is created. Here's another diagram that I found that I really like, and that's sunlight hitting this plant, chlorophyll, which is in the chloroplast, carbon dioxide coming in, energy coming in, and then glucose is formed and oxygen is released. Notice that water is coming into this plant up through here. So know the basic steps of this. Let's take a look at the next one. Here's another way to look at that equation that we looked at back in 4.1. So this is carbon dioxide from the air, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide from the air, 6 molecules of water, along with sunlight and chlorophyll, will make a glucose, 1 glucose molecule, C6H12O6, and it will release oxygen into the air. This is a really well done equation. Make sure you understand this. So in the cell, where does photosynthesis take place? So here's a typical plant cell, and you'll notice that it has these green organelles in it. So these green organelles are called chloroplast. Here's 1 chloroplast right here. And inside the chloroplast, you have grana, which are these stacks. You have inner and outer membranes. You have the stroma. You have what are called thylakoid discs here. And this is where photosynthesis takes place. I want you to note this. what they're looking at here is they're looking at one granum inside this chloroplast, and they have a measuring bar for you. That's 1 micron. So if you take a look at that, if you look at that granum, that might be about 5 microns wide. This diagram from your book is showing you the light reactions of photosynthesis. So this is happening in the chloroplast along its cell. Now, I'm not going to ask you to understand or to memorize this, and I won't ask minute questions from this. However, one of the reasons I have it in here, along with some other ones in this chapter, is keep in mind that in your next level of biology, this is the level you're going to be looking at the molecular level of photosynthesis and understanding it. And you're going to be talking about things like photosystem 1, photosystem 2. So just keep that. The second part of photosynthesis is called the Calvin cycle. And here, again, energy-rich molecules and ATP is being used to power the Calvin cycle. I don't want you to know this on a molecular level, but I do want you to know that the second step is the Calvin cycle. Now, one of the things I've said a couple times is virtually all life on the planet uses photosynthesis for energy. However, there are some life forms deep in the ocean that were discovered only in the 1970s that don't use sunlight as their energy source. However, they use chemical energy instead of sunlight, and that's called chemosynthesis. And those were discovered off the west coast of Costa Rica in the 1970s. And these are called vent communities, deep ocean vent communities. If you Google that, deep ocean vents, you'll see all the different life forms, especially these wild white worms that live down there. They're really, really interesting. But they don't use photosynthesis as the basis. They use chemicals. So let's take a look at the summary of 4.2. Most autotrophs make food using photosynthesis. It occurs in 2 stages, the light reaction, the Calvin cycle. Both stages take place in chloroplasts. The light reactions on the thylakoid membranes and the Calvin cycle take place in the stroma. That's those parts of the chloroplast that we looked at in a couple diagrams back. Read these other bullets. They talk about the energy-rich molecules. And at the end, remember, some bacterial autotrophs make food using chemosynthesis. Those are the ones in the vent communities deep in the ocean where there is no sunlight. So this ends section 4.1 and 4.2 screencast. And the next screencast will be talking about consumers and how we make energy from that glucose that's being made in photosynthesis.